In the hush of the royal chambers of Madrid, the year is 1834. You, the royal physician, stand over the body of Ferdinand VII. The king's tyrannical reign has ended, yet your work is far from complete. The Queen Regent, Maria Cristina, has summoned you for a task so extraordinary it defies belief, a final, chilling duty that will connect you to the king's darkest secrets. Your hands tremble as you approach the bed, where even in death, the monarch who terrorized Spain for 2 decades seems to mock you. But it isn't his face that commands your attention. It's what lies beneath the silk sheets, the anatomical monstrosity that defined his life and reign. The grotesque, oversized, and strangely shaped endowment, a source of both profound shame and twisted pride. As you begin the delicate preservation process, your mind drifts to the hushed stories of the palace corridors. You recall tales of custom-made cushions, terrified wives, and desperate attempts to secure an heir against nature's cruel joke. You are not simply preserving flesh and blood, you are preserving the physical manifestation of a reign that was, in itself, deformed, oversized, and ultimately destructive. The cursed bloodline of Spain's monarchy. To understand Ferdinand VII, you must first comprehend the genetic decay that cursed him. The Spanish Habsburgs and Bourbons, through generations of marrying cousins to cousins, created a genetic nightmare that led to everything from mental instability to physical deformities. Ferdinand was born from this toxic bloodline, the son of first cousins Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma. The genetic lottery had been rigged from the start, and Ferdinand would pay the price in the most intimate and humiliating way. As he grew, it became clear that nature had played a particularly cruel joke on the future king. By his teenage years, his endowment had developed in ways that defied medical understanding. Contemporary medical records, hidden for centuries in Vatican archives, describe the horror of his condition in clinical terms. One physician noted, "His Royal Highness is afflicted with a member of such extraordinary dimensions and peculiar form that intimate relations may prove challenging." Another was more blunt, comparing the organ to a billiard cue, thin at the base and thick as a man's fist at its extremity, long enough to serve as a walking stick. In an era where smaller, more refined anatomy was considered aristocratic, Ferdinand's massive member marked him as a freak of nature, a profound source of shame that would forever shape his character. The tyrant forged by dysfunction. Ferdinand's childhood was a masterclass in dysfunction. He was the product of a weak-willed father and a mother who openly flaunted her affair with Spain's de facto ruler. Young Ferdinand observed this daily humiliation, absorbing lessons about power, betrayal, and the weakness of trust. But it was his physical abnormality that truly molded him into a tyrant. The court buzzed with whispers about the prince's condition, with servants giggling and courtiers making subtle jokes. Foreign diplomats reported back to their masters about the Spanish embarrassment. This constant humiliation bred a deep, festering resentment that would later manifest in his brutal treatment of Spain itself. He became secretive, vindictive, and cruel to his servants, learning to use the power of his position to compensate for the powerlessness he felt over his own body. An incident recorded by a court chaplain tells of a young page who, after accidentally walking in on the prince, was not only flogged but had his family exiled from Madrid. The message was clear: no one could witness his shame and remain unpunished. A royal marriage built on trauma and deception. As Ferdinand neared marriageable age, the full extent of his anatomical challenge became clear. The royal physicians, in secret, documented a member of unusual configuration, with a thin base expanding to a disproportionate circumference and a length exceeding any recorded human specimen. Intimate relations would be impossible without significant medical intervention. Royal craftsmen were secretly commissioned to create specialized marital aids, including custom cushions and supports designed to make coitus possible without causing injury to his future wives. In 1802, Ferdinand married his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. Naive and innocent, she arrived in Madrid with romantic notions of her future husband. The wedding ceremony was magnificent, but the wedding night was a disaster. The sight of her husband's naked form sent Maria Antonia into hysterics. A lady-in-waiting wrote years later that, Her Majesty began screaming as though she had seen the devil himself. A team of physicians had to be called in to explain what would be required of her. What followed was a medical procedure more akin to surgery than lovemaking. Maria Antonia's body and mind were destroyed by years of sexual trauma, drug addiction to laudanum, which she used to endure the ordeal, and psychological abuse. After 2 devastating miscarriages, she died at the age of 21, her body and spirit broken. Ferdinand, meanwhile, blamed her for their failures, his paranoia twisting her suffering into perceived betrayal, an obsession with an heir. Ferdinand's quest for an heir consumed his life and reign. He married 3 more times, each marriage a grotesque replay of the first. His third wife, Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, arrived in 1819, having been better prepared for her ordeal. She treated her duties as a medical challenge, keeping detailed records of their intimate encounters. This clinical detachment only frustrated Ferdinand further, feeding his paranoia that she saw him as a curiosity rather than a husband. In 1829, after a decade of this clinical matrimony, Maria Josepha became pregnant. The news sent shockwaves across Europe. The pregnancy, however, ended in a premature, traumatic delivery. The baby girl lived for only a few hours, and Maria Josepha died 3 weeks later. Ferdinand's grief was indistinguishable from madness. He refused to allow their bodies to be buried, demanding that his physicians perform impossible resurrections. His final marriage to Maria Cristina of Naples in 1829 was a farce. Maria Cristina was already pregnant by another man. The birth of Isabella II in 1830 should have secured his dynasty, but it only created new anxieties. Ferdinand knew the child was not his, yet he had to maintain the fiction of legitimacy. His final years were a descent into complete paranoia. He conducted midnight raids on his wife's chambers, had peepholes drilled into the walls to watch her, and became obsessed with assassination plots. The man who had spent a lifetime unable to produce a living heir was now a ghost haunting his own palace, trapped in an escalating cycle of suspicion and anxiety. Ferdinand VII died in 1833, his body and mind finally succumbing to the accumulated stress of a lifetime spent battling his own anatomy and psychology. His death, however, was not the end of his legacy. The autopsy, conducted in secret and sealed in the Vatican archives, revealed an astounding 14-inch member with internal scarring and deformity evidence of years of secret, pathetic attempts at self-surgery. The preserved organ, a medical curiosity and a monument to human suffering, remains a stark reminder of how personal dysfunction can metastasize into national trauma. His reign demonstrated how private shame can become a public disaster and how the most intimate human failures can echo through history, consuming wives, children, and a nation itself. The medical and psychological conditions of Ferdinand VII. As a royal physician in 1834, the concept of psychological conditions, as we understand them today, was non-existent. However, looking back with modern medical knowledge, the tragic life of Ferdinand VII can be analyzed through a number of interconnected medical and psychological conditions that spiraled into a national catastrophe. Megalopenis, the anatomical curse. The most striking and documented condition was the one that defined his life, a grotesquely enlarged and malformed penis, a condition we would today term megalopenis. This is a rare disorder characterized by abnormal enlargement of the male genitalia, often due to hormonal imbalances. In Ferdinand's case, the genetic legacy of inbreeding within the Habsburg and Bourbon dynasties could have contributed to a hormonal disorder like pituitary gigantism or an overproduction of androgens. This would not only cause the continued growth of his genitals well into adulthood, but could also explain other rumored physical abnormalities and psychological issues. The peculiar curvature and additional tissue growths described by his physicians suggest a complex and unique malformation rather than a simple overgrowth. This physical anomaly was not just a medical problem, it was the root of his profound psychological distress. Body dysmorphic disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. Ferdinand's lifelong shame and paranoia about his anatomy could be seen as a severe form of body dysmorphic disorder, BDD. BDD is a mental health condition where a person is obsessed with perceived flaws in their appearance, often to the point of a distorted self-image. For Ferdinand, His flaw was real and undeniable, but his reaction was pathological. He was convinced he was an object of constant mockery, which led to his vengeful cruelty and his obsession with secrecy. Ironically, this deep-seated shame coexisted with traits of narcissistic personality disorder, NPD. Ferdinand believed himself to be a divinely ordained ruler, yet he was deeply insecure about his own body. He compensated for this insecurity with a grandiose sense of self, a need for constant admiration, and a complete lack of empathy for others. He viewed his wives not as people, but as tools to produce an heir and to validate his manhood. When they failed, he discarded them without a second thought. This psychological duality, profound self-loathing masked by a tyrannical and self-centered exterior, is a hallmark of a deeply disturbed individual. Post-traumatic stress and paranoia. The repeated, traumatic failures of his marriages and the constant, overwhelming pressure to produce an heir left him with what modern psychology would identify as post-traumatic stress. His sexual encounters, rather than being moments of intimacy, were medical procedures fraught with physical pain and psychological terror for both him and his wives. The miscarriages of Maria Antonia and Maria Josepha were not just personal tragedies, they were public humiliations that compounded his trauma. This trauma, combined with his BDD and NPD, spiraled into a pervasive paranoia. His belief that his wives were conspiring against him, that his servants were mocking him, and that foreign powers were actively working to sabotage his succession was not entirely baseless. People were talking about him, but his reaction was wildly disproportionate. He saw conspiracies in every corner, turning his palace into a suffocating surveillance state. This paranoia was a coping mechanism, a way to project his inner feelings of inadequacy and powerlessness onto the external world. Genetic and hereditary mental illness. Finally, we cannot ignore the genetic legacy of his family tree. Centuries of inbreeding left the Spanish monarchy with a known history of mental instability, including what we might now call hereditary mental illness. This genetic predisposition, combined with the extreme stresses of his life, created a perfect storm for his psychological unraveling. His volatile temperament, cruelty, and eventual descent into madness were likely the result of a biological predisposition exacerbated by his unique and tragic circumstances. Ferdinand VII was not just a cruel king, he was a deeply disturbed man, the product of a dysfunctional system and a cursed genetic lottery. His personal hell, rooted in his most intimate physical reality, became the hell of an entire nation. The story of his reign is a chilling reminder of how personal pathologies can, with absolute power, become a public disaster. Isabella II's life began under a shadow of doubt and deception. Born to Maria Cristina and a king who was desperate for an heir but unable to produce one, her legitimacy was a political fiction maintained through brute force. Ferdinand's final, desperate act was to abolish the Salic law, which prevented women from inheriting the throne, thus securing Isabella's succession over his ultra-conservative brother Don Carlos. But this act of paternal love, or more accurately, paternal desperation, plunged Spain into a civil war the moment Ferdinand's breath left his body. The Carlist Wars erupted, a bloody conflict between Isabella's liberal supporters and the Carlists, who championed Don Carlos, believing the Salic law to be the true inheritance tradition. Isabella, a toddler, was the living symbol of a national schism. Her reign was forged in the fire of civil war, a stark contrast to the deceptive calm of her father's paranoid rule. The puppet queen and a legacy of weakness. Isabella's childhood was spent under the constant threat of Carlist attack, a far cry from the suffocatingly paranoid, yet ultimately safe, existence her father created for himself. Her mother, Maria Cristina, served as queen regent, but the regency was a turbulent period. Maria Cristina was more interested in her secret marriage to a commoner than in governing, leaving Isabella to be raised as a political pawn. The court, once a theatre of Ferdinand's personal madness, became a stage for power struggles between liberal and conservative factions. Ferdinand's legacy of misrule had left Spain's institutions weak, its economy in tatters, and its people restless. Isabella inherited a crown of thorns, and the factions fighting for control of the government saw her as a tool, not a ruler. She was a child king in all but name, a monarch without any real power. This early lack of agency would haunt her throughout her reign, the echo of a failed marriage, Isabella's own doomed union. The most tragic echo of Ferdinand's life came in Isabella's own arranged marriage. The choice of a husband was a matter of intense international diplomacy. In the end, at just 16 years old, she was forced into a double marriage with her cousin, Francis, Duke of Cadiz. The choice was a disaster, a new iteration of her father's doomed unions. Francis was rumored to be homosexual, a fact that was likely known to the political forces who arranged the marriage, ensuring that Isabella would remain childless and thus easily manipulated. Isabella's wedding night, like her father's, was a humiliation. Her marriage was loveless and barren. The political machinations that shaped her life had denied her any chance at personal happiness. Francis's public effeminacy and Isabella's subsequent numerous extramarital affairs became a source of national scandal, a public spectacle that mirrored the private dysfunction of her father's bedroom, but on a grand, humiliating scale. The Spanish people, having endured a king whose personal failures were a state secret, now had a queen whose intimate life was an open, tawdry book, an unstable crown, from misrule to revolution. Isabella's reign was marked by political instability, military uprisings, and a series of short-lived, ineffective governments. She was a queen without a guiding hand, a woman who had been raised in a court of deceit and power struggles, with no one to teach her how to govern. Her father's obsession with his own intimate problems had left her without a stable foundation. She lacked the political cunning of a true monarch and became an easy target for ambitious generals and politicians. Ferdinand's legacy of paranoia and cruelty also lived on in Isabella's court. She ruled with a heavy hand, showing little tolerance for dissent, echoing her father's tyrannical tendencies. The army became the true power behind the throne, and military coups became the primary method of political change. The stability Ferdinand had so desperately tried to secure through his personal deceptions was a mirage, and Isabella's reign became the very picture of the chaos that had simmered beneath her father's oppressive rule. In the end, Isabella II's reign, a direct consequence of her father's life and choices, collapsed under the weight of its own instability. In 1868, a military coup forced her to abdicate, sending her into exile. The very monarchy Ferdinand had fought so desperately to preserve, and for which he had sacrificed his wives and his kingdom, was now overthrown. As you look upon the lifeless body of Ferdinand VII, you realize his curse was not merely an anatomical one. It was a political, social, and psychological inheritance passed down to a daughter who was ill-prepared and ill-equipped to bear it. Isabella II's life was the long, slow, and public unfolding of a tragedy that began with a deformed king and a desperate, impossible quest for an heir. She was the final, living testament to the fact that absolute power, when wielded by a man crippled by his own private demons, is not merely dangerous, it is a poison that can corrupt and destroy a kingdom for generations. The kingdom Ferdinand left behind was on the verge of financial collapse. His reign, marked by lavish spending on his personal obsessions, medical devices, spies, and military campaigns to quell dissent, had emptied the treasury. Loss of the American colonies. Ferdinand's refusal to recognize the independence of Spain's American colonies sealed the fate of the Spanish Empire. The vast wealth from the New World, which had sustained the monarchy for centuries, was gone. The new, independent nations of Latin America were now Spain's rivals, not its subjects. This loss of revenue, coupled with the high cost of the Carlist War, pushed Spain into a state of perpetual debt. Economic stagnation. Ferdinand's political instability and his resistance to any form of industrialization or economic reform meant that Spain was falling behind its European counterparts. While Britain and France were undergoing their industrial revolutions, Spain remained a predominantly agrarian, feudal society. This economic stagnation fueled the social unrest that led to the Carlist War and would continue to plague Isabella's reign. As you reflect on the chaos, you realize the grim irony. Ferdinand VII, a man so consumed by his private struggles, had inadvertently created a national disaster. His pathological obsession with securing a male heir led him to enact that, in its failure, ensured decades of bloodshed. The man who had terrorized his people for 2 decades now lay in state, but the terror he unleashed lived on, a dark and tragic legacy for a nation torn apart by his personal failures